Now, following on from genetics, following on from human reproduction, we're going to move into an area that now looks at all the living species that are on the planet. Okay, and there are hundreds of millions of them, new ones being discovered every day, and old ones actually dying out. So the earth is what we would say organic. It's continuously changing in terms of the species that it has and in terms of the numbers of individuals that it has. But within a given species, now when I talk about a species, I talk about a set of animals, not a set of animals, but a group of animals that have similar characteristics, okay? So within a given species, there's also change. Now we spoke about this when we were doing reproduction, and we said that genes, when they are passed on from the father and the mother, take characteristics from both parents and they blend them together so that you get a unique individual that will contain some characteristics of the mother, some characteristics of the father, and you have a unique new definition of characteristics. Okay, within any species that is alive, that variation is alive. So even if you take a group of 5 people in a family, if you look from one person to the other, there are variations in hair color, there's variations in height, there's variations in skin tone, there's variations all over the place. Okay, and every species or group of similar animals all have variations. There are subtle changes between the members of that particular group that we call a species. And those differences are what lead to better chances of survival or less chance of survival. Okay? And at the end of the day, obviously, animals that have a better chance of survival are going to survive over those that don't have a good chance of survival. And the ones that do have a good chance of survival, if the reason why they have a good chance of survival is genetic, in other words, in their DNA, then they can pass on those good characteristics to their offspring, giving a new generation of animals that have the good characteristics that will allow them to survive better. Okay? And that whole process is summed up in one word, and there it is on the screen: evolution. And every species on this planet is under the power of evolution. It's something that has been alive and organic since the very first moments of life being on this planet. And today, it's still alive and it's still organic. So when we talk about the planet as it is and all the species, that's the diversity. Now, you know what diversity means, okay? Diversity, it's not the group that sing and dance and jump and body pop all over the place. Not that diversity, but the diversity of life. The changes from one species to another. So what makes a gorilla a gorilla? What makes a crocodile a crocodile? What are the differences between a gorilla and a crocodile? Now go to gorillas. Even in a group of gorillas there are subtle differences. So what is responsible for the changes and the differences between 2 different gorillas? Okay, so that diversity, that level or that amount of change or difference that's around the world is extremely important because it's the diversity of life. Reproduction, as we said, causes an increase in the numbers of the same species. So when humans reproduce, the number of humans goes up. When dogs reproduce, the number of dogs go up. And so on for every species that is on this planet. Over long periods of time, their general characteristics may change. So for example, if you were to find some evidence of an animal that was living hundreds of millions of years ago, that was very long, had a tail and had fins and had sharp teeth and so on, you might be inclined to say it was related to the modern day shark. Okay? Because hopefully that's the animal that came into your head when I was describing that. Long body, lives in the sea, tail and sharp teeth. So it may be that it was related to the sharks of today. Okay? And what has changed from the early model of shark to today's model of shark could be several things. It could be the length of the tail, it could be the shape of the tail, it could be the position of the fins, it could be the size of the eyes, it could be the sharpness of the teeth. But as these species move on in time, a better word to use is they refine themselves. So they increase the goodness and they do away with anything that's not beneficial. So when they have a trait that's good, they refine that trait and it moves on to the next generation. And then over generations, it's continuously refined and put to work. Anything then that's not needed, anything that's of no use, I should say, is normally discarded. And even in the human body, there is example of evolution that's ongoing in order to rid ourselves of a very, very small appendage, which we call the appendix, okay? And it is suggested that over time, the appendix keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, because at this stage it really has no function. All right. And eventually what they say is that the time will come when there will be a generation of humans who will be appendixless. They'll have no appendix. So there's an example as to where, well, the body realizes the appendix is no good. So over generations and generations and generations and generations, evolution is going to do away with the appendix, so that eventually there will be no such thing as the appendix hanging off the end of your large intestine. Okay, so here's an example of where we have horses, okay? And if you look at the number of years, 50 million years ago here, then 35 million years ago, 26 million years ago, and 3 million years ago. Look at the differences. The most notable difference is obviously height, okay? The animal has gotten bigger over millions and millions of years. Not only that, the changes are not just visible on the outside. The changes are also visible in the skeleton on the inside. And I want you to take a look first of all at the skull, okay? Notice how the skull has changed in the prominence of the teeth. See that? Also in the size of the skull. But look at the foot. That looks like a human hand. There are 5 very definite individual bones at the bottom of this foot. Now, over time, if you think of a horse today, a horse has a hoof. So what seems to have happened is that these bones that were present in the early style horses have actually been modified or changed in order to give rise to what we know today as the hoof. Okay, and the other bones that were to the side of the hoof, they have kind of disappeared. They've got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they are no longer visible. So there are 3 changes here. First of all, height. Secondly, skull size and prominence of the front teeth. And thirdly, the change we see in the bone structure, the skeletal structure of the feet of this animal, which goes from individual bones down to fused bones and giving rise to what we call today the hoof. Okay. Fossils are one of scientists or geologists or biologists' best friends, because what a fossil is, it's a photograph from millions and millions of years ago. Okay, an animal dies, it gets trapped in sediment. Over millions and millions of years, that sediment is pressurized and forms a rock, so that when you open that rock, you get an imprint of exactly how that animal was on the time that it died. Okay, and fossils are fantastic for giving us a record going all the way back, a photographic record going all the way back to show us how a particular species may have been back when it existed hundreds of millions of years before where we are now. So also, fossils can give us evidence of the fact that there were species around the planet that are no longer here. Now, why did they die out? Well, that's a huge area of study itself. Why was there one day hundreds and hundreds of millions of dinosaurs and the next day none? Why was that the case? All right, that's an area of science that's ongoing. We're not fully sure of the answers, but we do know from fossil records that there were animals living on this planet, species of animals living on this planet that are no longer here. Okay, and one of the reasons, obviously, why they are no longer here is because reproduction became impossible. They couldn't reproduce future generations. So why were they not able to reproduce? Was it a mass extinction? Was it a very quick extinction? We don't know. But all we know is that reproduction became impossible. Because if they could reproduce, they'd still be here. Okay? And only those animals that could continue to reproduce and stay alive were the ones who managed to get their species right down through history to modern day. If you take this one here, take this fossil here, fossils serve as evidence of evolution. So you take the skeleton of a horse from 36 million years ago, you take the skeleton of a horse from today, and you compare, and you see the changes. And those changes are the evidence of evolution. Scientists use fossils to find similarities. So not only do they serve as evidence of evolution, they also show us how we are the same as those animals that came before us hundreds of millions of years ago. So scientists use fossils to find similarities between ancient species and the ones that are around today. So in other words, what they try to do is help us to build a pathway through history, charting how this species changed from the moment that it started to exist on Earth to the present day. Fossils' location on Earth and how deep underground they are allow us to figure out when they were actually alive on the planet. Okay, so the depth at which you have to dig to find a fossil will give us some idea as to how long ago this particular animal was on the earth. And lastly then, we expect an ancestral species to share some traits with modern species. Okay, so even, for example, the Tyrannosaurus rex, there are certain things present in a Tyrannosaurus rex that are present in some of the lizards that exist today. All right, now that's incredible to think of, that some of the characteristics present in the Tyrannosaurus rex, the huge big prehistoric monster, and the smallest of lizards that run around today, there are similarities. Okay, and those similarities tell us that obviously they came through the same channel of evolution. All right, maybe branched off at a certain part and became a new species, but we'll talk about that in a few moments. So the diversity of life is the changes that exist and the subtle changes that exist as we move not only from one species to another, i.e. from humans to dogs, from dogs to cats, but the subtle differences that exist within a group of species. Okay, so if you take dogs, for example, you've got Alsatians, you've got St. Bernards, you've got Cocker Spaniels, etc., 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 but they're all dogs. But the subtle differences from one species of dog to the next is what we call the diversity of life. The way that species change over hundreds of millions of years is called evolution. There are millions of different species on our planet today. Now, just as a typical example, in Ireland alone, there are almost 600 different species of seaweed. Now, they're all seaweed, but they have subtle differences, maybe in colour, subtle differences in what type of water they like, subtle differences in the temperature they prefer, subtle differences in the flavours, because seaweed is edible. Okay, you might think, mucky and slimy, but it's edible. People eat it. People used to eat it. People living on the coast used to use seaweed as fertiliser and as food. Okay, seaweed soup and so on. The way that they're branched, the leaves that they have, the bubbles they produce, they're all seaweed. But there's big differences as we move from one species of seaweed to the next. And that diagram there behind just gives you an idea of the type of species that are found on our coasts, along the coast of Ireland and along the coast of Britain. The diversity of life is present in every species. Now again, here's an example. There's the founding species, okay? So this is the one that existed from year dot. And over time, hundreds of millions of years, through evolution, we end up getting 6 species that have come from this one. Now, just take a quick look at that diagram and see, where are the subtle differences? Where have the changes taken place from the original model to today's model? And some of you will say straight away, oh, the beaks have changed. Correct. Okay. And even within the species that are there today, some have short beaks, some have very, very long beaks. Okay. Also, you'll notice the position of the eyes. Some of the eyes here are large and to the front. Some are very, very small and a little bit behind. Okay, some have developed black patches, some have developed white patches, like this one up here, or grey patches. Okay, some have developed a very, very long upper beak and a short bottom one. Others have kept the size of the beak exactly the same, but just thickened them. So there's a number of subtle changes that we can see as we go from the founding species out into the new species that exist as time marches on and as evolution takes hold. In 1859, a guy called Charles Darwin, there he is, down there, he published a book. And that book was called On the Origin of Species. And it was groundbreaking. Because basically what he was doing was he was challenging the conceptions or the knowledge that people thought they had about creation at that time. Okay? Out came this book and it rocked the world. Because it was producing or presenting a theory that nobody had heard of before. It was brand new theory. And it seemed to contradict, for number one, the Christian idea of how the world was formed and how the species were formed. And at that stage, the idea was that all species were permanent and non-changeable. Now we know from the evidence we have that there's a chance that that's not quite true. There are slight modifications taking place every time a new generation is produced. Okay, we're refining the good and we're losing the bad. That's what evolution is. So he published this book and he got into huge trouble because his father wanted him to either be a doctor or a priest, to follow the actual law of religion or follow the law of medicine, both of which at that stage were very similar. So he published this book and got into big trouble for it. But as time went on and as people began to read it, they began to realize this guy's onto something. this guy has something in here that actually makes a bit of sense, okay? And the lovely thing about Darwin, and by the way, I have a video there that I want you to watch on Darwin. I think it's on, maybe on the next slide. He went traveling. He had to get evidence. All good scientists who write books, they can't just write a book on a conspiracy theory, okay, or a novel idea they have. They've got to back up with evidence. So he went off to what we call the Galapagos Islands. And when he was in the Galapagos Islands, he was looking at the different species of birds and other animals and lizards and so on that were there in plants. And he was trying to put together evidence that the evolutionary process was a very real one. Okay, and that's the book that came out, On the Origin of Species. And he suggested that evolution not only changed subtly from one generation to the next, but also gave rise to new species completely. So you had this kind of a branch. So there was a species, and all of a sudden, something changed radically that caused a new species to exist. And then you had two species. But you notice that they came from a common ancestor. Okay? So there might be subtle changes within a species as time goes on. Then there might be a sudden big change that simply causes a rupture and causes a new species then to evolve alongside the original. And then we have two species of the same group of animals. Okay. So I want you to do a bit of research, and I'm going to pause the video now, okay? And I want you to do a bit of research. You can use Google for this, or you can use your textbook, whatever you want to use yourselves. But look, for God's sake, if you're going to use Google or Wikipedia, will you use the kid-friendly one? Don't use huge, big scientific language that I can't even understand. If you're typing up anything you want to research, put the word kids at the end of it so that you get sites that have nice scientific language and age-appropriate science. What evidence did Darwin have to support his theory of evolution by natural selection? So in other words, I want you to go and research, what did he do when he was in the Galapagos? Okay, when he took this journey off to the Galapagos, what did he do? What animals did he watch? What plants did he watch? Okay, what other organisms did he watch? Where did he get his evidence from? So I simply want you to go, look up the journey of Darwin to Galapagos. Have a look and see if you can get a nice simple site that explains in easy scientific language how he recorded his data. We're going to go through this in the live class on Thursday. I'm going to be asking people to read out what they have researched and what they have discovered about Darwin's visits to the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so that's your first part of exercise today. So you can pause now and off you go and do that exercise. Okay, so now that you're back and you finished that, Darwin also came up with a theory about how evolution takes place. Okay, so not only did he say that there seems to be evidence of subtle changes from one species to the other, and that seems to be happening every successive generation, he actually went so far as to say, okay, let's go backwards. If new species can come out of old ones, then if I was to go all the way back through this net, surely I would end up at the beginning where I would have one species. Now, this was an incredible theory at the time, okay? So he was looking to say, yeah, species go, and then another one comes out here, and you get this kind of a branching, get a kind of a tree, okay? Now, if you follow the branches of a tree backwards, where do you end up? You end up at the trunk. So you bring all the branches inwards down, and you end up at a trunk, which means a common beginning. So he suggested that, thanks to his research, which you've now just looked up and written about, he suggested that all species could be traced back to a common ancestor, okay? And he called that particular theory the tree of life. So if we took something like this way here and out here, and then this one branched off, went out here, and then we had another branch this way, then that branched off here, and this branched off, then that branched off, and that branched off, and then you're getting all these new species being generated. However, all these species here, what do you notice? Had one common ancestor down there. That's what he called the tree of life. Okay, let's get rid of that terrible scribble. Whoops. Whoops, what did I do? I did the wrong button. Apologies. Okay, that's my mistake. Okay, now there's the video. I need you to look at that. I'm going to put it into Google Classroom as well. I'll put the link into Google Classroom for you because you don't have the slides yet. So they will be underneath today's lesson. And I want you to watch that video on Darwin. It's a nice little video. It gives you an idea as what's going on in terms of his journeys and his theory and where we are at the moment. It's only about 2 minutes long, so it's not going to kill you, but do have a look at it. It's good. So here's the tree of life, okay? Now what does it look like? Give me an idea of what the tree of life looks like. Well, something like that, see? Where all these different species of plants and animals, what do you notice? Go backwards. This comes down here, this one comes down here, this one comes in here, this comes down. Do you notice that they all have a common start? Yeah? So Darwin's theory suggests that all of the millions of species alive on the planet today, i.e. all of these things up here, may have evolved from other species, many of which are now extinct, as we know. Okay, he suggested that you could trace the evolution of every living species back to the very first living thing. So in other words, he was saying if you were to trace all these branches backwards, you would get a common beginning where there was something, some organism, that over time then gave rise to new species and populated and covered the entire globe. He called, as I told you already, he called this idea the tree of life. And species that were related to one another, well, they were on the same branch. So for example, if you take a look over here, take this branch, what do you notice? If you take this branch here, you notice that you get plants. See that? So if I take this branch, you've got the plants. And all those plants are related to one another because they're on the same branch. Okay. Likewise over here, you've got things like amoebas and tiny little unicellular organisms. So if you go this branch, you get this group. And because they're all on the same branch, they're all related to one another. So his theory was twofold. He said species on the same branch all have a common kind of a bond. Okay. They're related to one another. But he also said if you follow all the branches backwards, everything came from the same starting point. There was something at the beginning that gave rise to all these species. Now there's just a branch, okay? Here's a branch of that particular tree. And there we are. That's us. Now, who else is on this branch with us? Well, other what we would call hominids, okay? Other ape-like creatures. So you have the chimpanzees and the gorillas and the orangutan. Does it mean that we came from the chimpanzee? Does it mean that the orangutans gave the gorillas and the gorillas gave the chimps and the chimps gave the humans? No. What it simply means is that because we're on the same branch, we have a common bond. And therefore, by having a common bond, we have down here somewhere a common ancestor. And that's what the tree of life was trying to explain to people of the time. That if you're on the same branch, you've got a common bond. Okay. By the way, we share 99% of our genetic DNA exactly the same as the chimpanzees. There's only 1% difference in our DNA between us and them. Okay. So there is a huge common bond between these two hominids. That's why they're on the same branch. But if you go back along the branch and go down through the trunk, there is a common starting point from which all these species came from. So I don't want you to think that just because they're on the same branch, one came from the other. That the gorilla popped out of the orangutan, or the chimpanzee popped out of the gorilla, or the humans popped out of the chimps. No. There's a common bond, there's a common starting point for all these species. And these are the results of fine tuning that have brought about 4 species of hominids. This particular part of the tree of life shows that humans are related to apes and other chimps, gorillas and orangutans, but it doesn't suggest that we come from chimps, or that human and chimps, it does not suggest that we come from chimps, but it does suggest that we have common ancestors. We've got a common starting point from which then these 4 groups or these 4 species of hominids evolved. So when we think about animals back hundreds of millions of years ago, and then we think of those animals today, what has happened is that only those who are strong enough and fit enough to reproduce have managed to pass their species down through time. Okay? And that phenomenon of being strong enough to survive and therefore being able to reproduce is what we call natural selection. And I know we said this before. Natural selection is where we refine the good and then we eliminate the bad. So, for example, if there is a characteristic in a certain species that is not of any use, over millions and millions of years into the future, that will be very much reduced, okay? But if there's another characteristic that helps this particular species to live well, live long and reproduce, then you'll discover that that particular characteristic will be refined and passed on, okay? So there's a 2-pronged process to evolution, and what we call natural selection. One is to refine and pass on the good, and the other one is to eliminate and get rid of the bad. And I did tell you an example here is the appendix in the humans. We have no need for it. Now, what does the appendix do, by the way? The appendix stores cellulose, and it holds very special bacteria that work on cellulose. So because rabbits eat a lot of grass, they have a very long appendix, which is very active. we don't need it anymore. So over time, our evolution is going to see the end of the appendix. So they say, the end of the appendix over the next couple of millions of years of the human evolution cycle. So, apologies. Natural selection is the process whereby living things that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. So if you get through from birth to adulthood and you produce your offspring, that's a healthy species. At the end of the day, the reason why species exist is for reproduction, okay? To make sure that when they go, there are more there to replace them. The ability to compete for food, the ability to avoid predators, the ability to resist disease will all increase your ability to survive. So if you're able to get a good share of food, if you're able to avoid being caught and eaten, and if you're able to stay healthy and not succumb to disease, you're going to make it. You're going to get right through, you're going to reproduce, and you're going to populate an area of your given species. Okay, so they would be a couple of examples of what's important in terms of good, what we would say, refining the good, being able to compete for, so being strong, good muscular tone, avoid predators, camouflage. You develop a good camouflage where you blend, okay? To resist disease, a good immune system. These are all things that nature wants to pass on to future generations to make them able to survive for longer, and hence make them able to reproduce when that time in their life comes. Variations change an organism's chances of survival. So for example, take a look at this. Now, out of these three here, you see what happens. This one has access to food. These two, no access to food. What happens to these two? Dead. Okay? They die because they can't eat. Simple as that. And what happens is, over time, we're left with giraffes whose necks are long enough to reach the branches of the trees they need to get their food from. So here's an example of where we refine the good. See that? We're refining and spreading the good, and we are eliminating the bad. That's natural selection in action. You enhance and refine the good, so therefore as giraffes go on in terms of their generations, we see more and more with neck lengths that are needed to make sure they can eat. And we see less and less of the smaller ones that can't reach the branches to eat because they simply die away. So if you have something that is not going to aid good development, it's going to die away. Variation is essential for natural selection to occur. So animals better suited environments tend to live longer. Now, take a look at this diagram here. Okay, I hope you can see that there are 4 moths on this particular picture. 2 of them have placed themselves into a very good position where their chances of being eaten are very slim. Okay, this guy here and this guy here. But the other 2 confused Egypts have put themselves in the wrong place and make themselves very available to become a snack for a bird passing by, because the white one on a black background is very visible and the black one on a white background is very visible. So therefore these ones here that can't understand camouflage will disappear. They'll be eaten, and if they're eaten, that means that the silly genes they have that puts the white moth on a black background and the black moth on a white background will disappear. They can't reproduce. So you won't get any other moths generations that'll put the white moth into a black background and the black moth into a white background. Okay? These moths here, they're the clever ones. They know, oh look, I have dark wings. I better go into a dark place. Oh look, I have white wings. I better go into a white place. Clever. They've got the intelligence to sort out the fact that when they move into the correct position, they're going to be camouflaged and less available to be a snack to a passing bird. What does that mean? If they're less available as a food source, they're more likely to stay alive for longer and reproduce more moths that will know how to camouflage themselves. Beneficial characteristics, if they are inheritable, now that goes back to 2 chapters before when we're dealing with genetics. If you can pass on your beneficial, if you can refine the good and pass it on, then that's going to help the survival rates of your offspring. Okay. Over many generations, natural selection causes beneficial characteristics to become more common in a species. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm making mistakes in my reading, I don't have my glasses, so I can't see what I'm doing. I'm getting very old and I'm losing my eyesight, so I can't really see some of the words. I don't know where they are. Anyway, so over many generations, natural selection causes beneficial characteristics to become more common in a species. Okay, so natural selection causes beneficial characteristics to become more common. So therefore you get camouflage happening more frequently. You get longer necked giraffes. You get thicker fur polar bears, etc. All right. An adaptation is a characteristic that improves the chances of an organism surviving and reproducing. That's the key aim of every species, to reproduce a new generation. So an adaptation is a characteristic that improves the chances of an organism surviving and reproducing. So for example, take the polar bear, I mentioned him a moment ago. Thick fur in the polar bear allows them to live in cold areas. If you brought a brown bear from Canada to the Arctic, number one, he would stick out like a sore thumb. He'd be a brown bear on white ice, okay? But number two, their hair is thinner than the polar bears, so they would die of hypothermia. Simple as that. They would freeze, okay? So they're not adapted to live in the Arctic. However, put the brown bear back in Canada, the brown fur helps them to hide in the forests amongst the brown vegetation, okay? And because Canada is a relatively warm country, their fur is just of the right quantity to make sure that their body temperature stays where it should be. So look at the polar bears. Polar bear, white fur. Why? Because they live on white ice, so they camouflage themselves. All right. Very, very thick fur. Why? To keep the heat in of the body, so that they don't succumb to the very, very cold temperatures. Long claws. Why? Because they dig dens to protect themselves from cold winds. Okay. Big paws to make them good swimmers, because they're going to be moving from ice through water back to ice again. All right. White fur, as we said, is camouflage. The thick layer of fur and fat help them to stay warm. And the small little round ears that you notice, look, see the ears? The small little round ears will keep the heat in. If you had big ears radiate a lot of heat, okay? Small ears keep the heat in. So therefore the ears are small so that they don't lose too much body heat out through their ears. They evolved to have thick coats because there was variation in the thickness of coats amongst their ancestors. And natural selection, what did it do? It meant that those with the thickest coats were adapted best to survive and reproduce. Okay, so here's the second part of your exercise for this class, a second piece of research. You have to choose any animal or plant, and you have to describe the characteristics of the species, describe its habitat, and describe its way of life. And then ask yourself a question. In what ways does the species appear to be adapted to where it is and how it lives? So say you pick the moth, okay? Describe the characteristics of the moth. Describe its habitat, where it lives. Describe how it lives its life. How does it feed and so on. And then tell me, how is the moth designed to increase its chances of survival? And you can do that with any animal. But that's your second piece of research. I want you to pause this video now, go and do that research. And in the live class on Thursday, I'm going to come back and I want to hear some of your answers.